Hello and welcome to the first of our series of the dark side of AI. This is a session that is organized under the aegis of Digital Futures, collaboration with FIU. Digital Futures is, I should say, for those who don't know, is an organization that has been set up as a form of para-educational system, a platform, shall we say, where we use our digital platform to disseminate important ideas across the globe, literally across the globe. The idea is that we can use the platform to break through not just the physical walls of the classroom, but also the social, economic, and political barriers that normally prevent certain people from having access to certain key ideas. And the Doctoral Consortium in particular is an attempt to rethink the logic of doctoral education, whereby instead of having individual professors with a small group of students in various classrooms around the world, we actually come together on a single platform in order to share resources, but also to share ideas themselves. I like to think of it as a kind of global brain. So this series is, we've going to have several series before in the past looking at the positive side of AI, what AI can contribute. And this one is reflecting some of the issues that have been now arising with the realization of how dominant AI is going to become within society and the potential negative side of things. I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to welcome Martin Ford, someone who has been hugely influential in the world itself, and certainly for me personally. He is the author of 4 books, and I'm going to refer to the second, third, and fourth book. The Rise of the Robots was really something of a bombshell. It came out in 2015, The Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future, and was a winner of a number of prizes and is a New York Times bestseller. He followed that up with Architects of Intelligence that came out in 2018, and that also is an incredible resource. It's a series of interviews with all the kind of luminaries within the field of AI, people like Ray Kurzweil, people like Geoffrey Hinton, and so on. And it is an incredibly important compilation. For those architects in the audience, I should say that this doesn't refer to architects in the architectural sense. This is referring to the computer science understanding of architecture. And then finally, Rule of the Robots, How AI Will Transform Everything, came out in 2021, and is an enormously helpful book. I've got all 3 of these books, and they've been very important to me, so it's a real great honor to have Martin here today. I'm going to say no more, but simply to say that we are operating on both YouTube and Zoom. We have a Zoom audience here, and we have a YouTube audience, and those in the YouTube audience will be able to ask questions towards the end. But first of all, I will be talking to Martin and asking a few questions, and then the Zoom audience will join in. Martin, welcome. It's great to it's great to have you here. Let me just stop sharing a second. My apologies for the early start. It's early on the West Coast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So maybe to kick things off, perhaps you could just give us a kind of brief overview of particularly the last book, the Rule of the Robots, and what were the key ideas that you were encapsulating in this particular book. I must say that it's so full of information. It's a wonderful book. Martin.
Yeah, my intention of the book was that it would be kind of an overview and also hopefully a good introduction to artificial intelligence where maybe people hadn't given that subject a lot of thought. And it does cover certainly both sides of AI. The positives, which I think are on balance still the most important thing, the fact that AI will, for example, enable us to make enormous advances in science and technology. It will become our most important tool. It will become essentially a way to enhance our own intelligence and creativity. So the book makes a strong positive argument for AI, but then the other aspect of the book is the issues that we're going to talk about today, the dark side, the problems, the things that I believe we have to confront. So the book offers an overview of the history of AI, as well as it delves into how deep learning, which is, the central technology behind the recent advances in artificial intelligence, how that actually works. And then it delves into the implications of AI, and in particular, I talk about the potential impact on the job market, which is sort of an extension of the work I did in Rise of the Robots in 2015, which is really focused on the potential for jobs to displace or for artificial intelligence and robotics to displace a lot of workers in many different fields. And I personally believe that that's going to be an enormously important issue for us going forward. And then the book also delves into many of the other concerns that we really have to worry about with AI, everything from impacts on our privacy to the potential for misinformation and fabricated media, what we call deep fakes, the potential for weaponization of AI, and also the potential, I think, far in the future for a potential existential threat from AI, which is something that people talk a lot about. So it covers all of that material, but there is a central kind of theme to the book, which is that artificial intelligence has become a truly systemic technology. In other words, a general purpose technology. And the comparison I make in the book is really to electricity. And you think of how electricity impacts your life, how dependent we are on electricity. Virtually, everything we do in our daily lives and every, obviously our entire economy is virtually completely dependent on electricity, which is why it's such a disaster if we lose electrical power even for one day. I think that we're clearly evolving very rapidly into a future where artificial intelligence is going to be a similar force in our lives and in terms of our dependence on it in our economy and our society. So this is something that I think is crucial to understand in terms of how ubiquitous AI is becoming and how dependent we are becoming on it. But at the same time, it's crucial to understand the differences. Electricity is really a commoditized power source, right? It's the same everywhere. It's totally reliable. It's static. It doesn't change over time. Back in 1950, the electricity that was available is basically the same as what we have today. Whereas artificial intelligence is going to become a lot like electricity in terms of that ubiquitousness, in terms of that level of dependency, the fact that it becomes this kind of general resource that we utilize, but at the same time, it's vastly more dynamic. It is, rapidly, as we know, as we've seen over the past year or so, especially, rapidly increasing its capability. It's going to become even more dramatically capable in the future. It's also going to be vastly more unpredictable than electricity. So it's going to be, I think, in many ways, a force that genuinely shapes the future. I think it is our most consequential technology. I think that, the future of artificial intelligence, to a large extent, is going to determine the future of our society and our economy. And so it's an incredibly important subject, really, for everyone to have a strong grasp of. And I think that was sort of my motivation for writing the book, to try to at least make one attempt at creating a resource that would be a good introduction.
No, I think the book is incredibly helpful as a kind of resume and overview of everything. Curiously, I was working on the same area myself, and when I look at the same, my book came out later 2021, very similar issues that we dealt with, but yours goes into much more detail into the kind of the dark side, the potential dark side of all these issues. One of the issues that I wanted to just talk about, sort of first of all, is the way in which things have shifted from the first book that you were talking about, which is primarily just about robots, into the world of AI, and now this thing about how has the change happened. Can I just say one thing, that I find the book is so rich in information. It's an astonishing resource. I was thinking of this very dense cake you get in Siena called the panforte, which is really, really dense. And it reminded me the book is so packed with information, and I think it's really amazing to have this kind of fly on the wall view from a kind of a Silicon Valley sort of viewpoint, informing us about what's going on, because there are many insider stories that you're able to tell that other people do not have access to. And I think to bring it together in one book that is useful. But maybe, can I say one thing the only thing I would have differed on, is going to sound you out, this is in the book, I noticed that by the final chapter, you talk about robots and AI as almost separate entities, but you present it as though they're elsewhere, as though they're together. And I always wonder whether we should do that in terms of a lot of people used to think that AI meant robots, and I think now they probably think it means ChatGPT or something like that. But whether we should be differentiating between the physical world of robots and the AI that is informing them in some ways. Is that a distinction that you're beginning to sort of sense? I notice in the book you're addressing the limitations in terms of the dexterity of robotic arms, which are still very limited, versus the huge advances that are happening in the world of AI.
Right. Obviously the two things are closely related, and it's complicated by the fact that there's a general tendency to use the word robot as kind of a catch-all that includes artificial intelligence as well. That obviously the title of the most recent book is Rule of the Robots, but it's mostly a book about AI. So in that sense, I'm using robot in a broad sense to, include basically what we would think of as software robots, right? Which would be just artificial intelligence. But the other distinction, the real distinction there is that a robot is something that physically manipulates the world, right? Whereas artificial intelligence is essentially just software. Robots have been around for a long time, but the early story of robots, especially industrial robots and factories and so forth, is that they weren't in any way intelligent, really. They're just machines that are programmed to do exactly the same thing again and again. And that was enormously disruptive in automotive manufacturing and so forth, where there are many tasks that can be done just by a machine that is programmed precisely to do repetitive tasks. But now we're entering really a new age where these two technologies are coming together. And what you could say is that artificial intelligence, and in particular, the most recent technological development in AI, which is deep learning, that's really the force that animates robots. And that's the reason that we're now seeing, for example, in Amazon warehouses, the introduction of these robots that are beginning to approach human level dexterity. And that's, now we have robots that, unlike those big industrial robots in the past, can deal with unpredictable situations, right? They have visual perception. They have something close to human dexterity. So they don't have to be precisely programmed. They don't have to, the big industrial robots of the past are dependent on a conveyor belt bringing a part at exactly the right time and exactly the right place, so that robot can then grasp it and do something with it. Whereas the robots we're seeing now are much more human-like in the ability to use, for example, machine vision to determine where the thing that they want to grasp is, and so forth. So it's the technologies are coming together, but in general, I would say that robots involve physical manipulation. So in general, we can kind of say that in terms of the job market, robots are going to be a threat to blue-collar workers, whereas artificial intelligence more generally is going to be a threat to white-collar workers. But both of them are going to, both of those kinds of jobs are going to be clearly disrupted by these technologies.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the comments I came across was that basically that robots are still struggling to do these kind of things. You dump a pile of Lego bricks on a table for a robotic arm to recognize them and put them together and so on. Is still something of a challenge. Whereas what we've seen since the publication of your book has been an enormous explosion in terms of AI. And especially, I guess, in terms of some of the issues that you're laying out here. I think what was interesting to me in terms of the book is you talk about regulation as being important in the future. And of course, just this last week, we've seen firsthand about why people are concerned about these things. But maybe I could I think one of the issues, of course, when you're dealing with these technologies is how fast they change. And in fact, the industry of publishing books is never quick enough to deal with those changes. So whenever a book comes out, it's almost by definition out of date. But this is actually very prescient in terms of what you predict. But I was going to maybe ask you about some of the the kind of issues that have presented themselves since the publication of the book. Obviously, we've seen, for example, the demonstrations in Hollywood about the loss of jobs. We've seen a whole series of lawsuits potentially about copyright things. We've got discussions about bias. We've got discussions about many things you talk about. But what it's been, I think, characterizes, to my mind, the last few months has been the kind of alarm bells about the capability of AI itself. We have, for example, the famous letter by the Future of Life Institute, which you kind of predicted in some sense, because you mentioned Max Tegmark in your book. We have, for example, the work of, I don't know if you know the work of Mo Gaudet, who was working for Google and who has been sounding the alarm about AI. And maybe this is an extreme position, but he goes so far as to say that it's a bigger threat than climate change, ... And then, of course, we have the Geoffrey Hinton, who you mentioned extensively, and he's kind of like the godfather. And he also is kind of, having resigned from Google, is sounding the alarm about those things. What do you make of those recent developments, these alarm about AI that's happened since the publication of your book?
Right. In truth, the book pretty much discusses all of these dangers. I mean, I don't think that anything has changed there. I mean, people that were connected to artificial intelligence and thinking about it a lot recognized all of these dangers, and that's what I talk about in the book. What has really happened is that ChatGPT in particular has just captivated the public, right, and has put these issues on the radar in a way that they never were before. And it's remarkable that, as you say, even people like Geoffrey Hinton, who is obviously, arguably the single person most responsible for the advances in deep learning that got us to this point, I think even was really obviously kind of shell-shocked by what ChatGPT could do, and was, I think, surprised by its capabilities, and as a result of that, has maybe, in my opinion, even gone a little bit overboard in terms of his concern about the risks from these technologies. I don't necessarily believe that ChatGPT represents the leading edge of what we call artificial general intelligence or human level intelligence. I think that it's a remarkable tool that's going to become obviously even more powerful, but I don't personally, my opinion is I don't believe that we're looking at a machine that's really beginning to think in the human sense that is going to have that level of capability. So it could well be that the large language models that underlie ChatGPT are an incredibly important tool that's going to get better and better, but they aren't necessarily, at least without the introduction of other innovations, they aren't necessarily the path to, the science fiction artificial intelligence where you've got a machine with true human level intelligence. I think that that's going to require more breakthroughs in the future.
Yeah, maybe we could just touch on these large language models. I think they've kind of flown under the radar for most people. We've seen references in the press. Obviously, they've been very important within that, but they're kind of a bit confusing. First of all, it's an understatement to say they're large language models. These are absolutely ginormous, massive models. But it's what I guess I think for and Hinton himself, he makes I mean, from what I discovered, it's really these are the issues. I would say just one thing is apparently Geoffrey Hinton signed up for architecture, the discipline of architecture, for 2 days at the University of Cambridge, where I studied. Then he transferred, so he didn't think architecture was for him, but he was initially interested in it. But it's the large language models that seem to be the issue in many ways. And I think with Hinton, one of the moments important for him was when he asked Palm had to explain a joke to him, and it responded so convincingly that he began to think it had some level of understanding. Now that was his kind of alarm bell. If you understand something, if you explain something, then you must be able to understand it. But maybe one thing that I've not heard much discussion of, but seems to me central to these large language models, is the kind of what they call the emergent capabilities of these language models. The fact that they can learn So they've learned to write code, they've learned to translate without being trained in some way. That seems to be the central issue. Do you want to comment on that, how they've managed to learn these things? Because that, to my mind, is in some sense scary, because we didn't expect that, and yet they're able to do this despite not being trained to do so.
Right. So, in their essence, what large language models do is that given a sequence of words, they predict the next word, and they're astonishingly good at that. And that same capability can be applied to computer programming. If you analyze enough computer code, you can get very good at predicting what the next word will be in an equation, even if it's not English text, but rather computer code. And that's basically what's going on here. But I think the key insight to understand is that large language models essentially read or basically inhale these enormous amounts of text, and then they get good at predicting output, right, and generating text. But they don't. There's no particular reason to believe that there's any actual understanding there of what's happening. They're just in kind of a very mechanical way producing output. So, the machine doesn't understand what exactly it's saying. It just is able to generate a sequence of words. And this is the key insight, I think, and this is the reason I say that I don't think large language models are necessarily the path to general intelligence. If you think about how intelligence evolved in the animal kingdom, it basically is a tool that allows animals, including human beings, to adapt to their environment, right? To find their prey or escape their prey or survive better. But basically, the development of intelligence required manipulating the world, right? In order to become intelligent, you need to be an animal that can see, that can move through the world and actually manipulate the world, right? And that's how intelligence evolved. A large language model doesn't have that capability. So it's kind of like asking the question, could a human being become intelligent just by reading without the ability to actually touch or manipulate or experiment in the world? I mean, even newborn babies, right, almost from the moment that they're born, they begin to actually manipulate the world, right? They reach out and touch things and so forth. Large language models can't do that. They're limited to just consuming text or other kinds of media. So it's unclear that you can really become intelligent just by doing that and really developing that understanding of, for example, having a physical model of the world and understanding the physics of the world and how things work. And I think there's something of a debate about that. Some people do disagree. They think that maybe it is possible, but personally, I think that probably other innovations will be required to take us to that next level.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that. But to my mind, it's really the size of these models, which I find really astonishing. The fact that the code involved in a large language model is only about 2,000 lines long, and yet the bigger they get, they start developing these kind of curious, what they call emergent capabilities. And I noticed which is a very strange term. I don't know if you've looked into it or familiar with it, but it appears in that letter of life thing in the main paragraph as being the issue. And if I have a background in swarm intelligence, well, emergence is a kind of interesting issue. But it seems that these things are unpredictable and they emerge out of the size of the thing. So that's the issue that some people seem to be worried about, the size of these large language models.
That's right. I mean, there's always been an issue with transparency in terms of deep learning. I mean, just in the same way that we don't understand how the human brain works. I mean, these are a very rudimentary expression of the way neurons operate in the brain, right? A kind of a, much less complicated than the brain, but it's still, what we're doing here is we're creating a relatively simple software program and then giving it enormous amounts of data, and that system is not necessarily transparent to us. there's not really an understanding of exactly what's happening within these enormous models. And that's in some areas, that's a real issue in terms of, for example, deep learning systems are used in very high stakes scenarios like the criminal justice system, right? These systems can make a recommendation should a person be released on bail. And in instances like that, it is crucial to understand exactly how that recommendation is being generated, right? In order to make sure that it's fair and just and not discriminatory and so forth. So the transparency is actually an important issue in AI that a lot of people are working on.
So one of the important sort of comparisons you make in your last book, which wasn't in the second book, is really the kind of the neuroscience side of things, the way in which somehow there are certain kind of parallels, shall we say, between the two black boxes, the black box of the brain and the black box of these massive language models. And I guess that's the kind of interesting thing, to what extent we can see those parallels without being able to prove anything. As you say, unless you understand it, you can't prove it. But nonetheless, there's certain things that come out. And I would sort of, my hunch is that personally is that actually maybe these things are not so dissimilar from how we operate. I came across Stephen Wolfram in his book on ChatGPT, who was kind of suggesting, okay, they are based on this very simple process of what is the next word of the sentence, but maybe they're telling us something about how we speak, how we write, and maybe it's not as complex as we think. To what extent do you buy into that kind of comparison between the mind and deep learning?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, a reasonable argument. Again, I don't think that large language models by themselves capture the necessary capabilities that we have in the brain, and in particular, as I said, this ability to manipulate the world and create a physical, model of the world and so forth. But definitely, there, in terms of the implementation of what it can do, there are clear parallels. I mean, in the book, the company that has delved the most into this is DeepMind, right? Google's artificial intelligence subsidiary that is based in London. This is the company that created AlphaGo and so forth. And DeepMind actually employs, neuroscientists, right? People who are skilled in the human brain as well as computer scientists, and they kind of work together. And DeepMind has demonstrated in a number of cases that within their deep learning systems, things can spontaneously arise that are actually similar to the brain. For example, the way that we navigate in the brain, a phenomenon known as grid cells is one thing I talk about in the book. They found something similar in a deep learning model. So there is an argument out there that maybe there is something like a kind of aerodynamics of intelligence, right? An underlying theory of how, or a set of principles of how intelligence works, and those principles would apply to both artificial intelligence and human intelligence in the same way that the principles of aerodynamics or the principles of flight would apply to both airplanes and birds, right? Even though they're entirely different in their approach. Airplanes aren't modeled on birds, they don't flap their wings, but the fundamental physical principles of both airplanes and birds are obviously the same. Is it possible that there's a similar underlying set of principles for intelligence? And then some people think that might be the case. And virtually every computer scientist that I've ever talked to believe that it is fundamentally possible that we will ultimately build an AI system that matches or exceeds human level intelligence. I mean, there isn't any reason to believe that true intelligence is strictly a biological phenomenon, right? And that you can't build it in another substrate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, we had actually Jeffrey Hawkins on our podcast a while back, and of course he takes one particular view that basically these things are nowhere near intelligent as a human being, and we must judge it in terms of human intelligence. But increasingly, and this is again picking up on the work of Jeffrey, that basically that there is a different form of intelligence that is very different to our intelligence, but is superior in some senses. I mean, the fact that ChatGPT knows 10,000 times as much as one individual. And I guess the question is, the one that I like to pose to myself is, what if we were to flip that round? I mean, we're looking at AI and saying it can't do this, it can't do what humans do, it hasn't got consciousness, it hasn't got this, it hasn't got that. But what if we were to flip it round and take the AI view and look at human beings and say, well, they don't have this, they don't have this. Would that be a position that you would endorse, or would you be skeptical about that?
No, I mean, I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. It is true that we don't understand how the human brain works, but we do know that at the lowest possible level, it's just a bunch of neurons, right? We know that. The question is, as you sort of increase the level of abstraction, somehow those neurons become a mind, right? A brain. And we don't understand how that happens. And yes, it's very possible that if you zoom in, on the human brain, that perhaps what's happening is every bit as mechanical as what we see happening in artificial intelligence systems, right? It's only as you kind of zoom out and look at the big picture, at some point, these neurons connected by electrochemical signals and so forth become what we consider a human mind, right? And there's probably a similar phenomenon going on with artificial intelligence. So there definitely are parallels, and I think it's entirely valid to look at it in that way.
Maybe we can just focus on the negative consequences. And there's one chapter in which you list out all these the negative consequences or potential negative consequences of AI. One particular I think stands out to my mind anyway, and that is the way of the idea of autonomous weapons. Of course, we know Stuart Russell and his concerns about that. I'm trying to remember the name of the bots. What's the name of the movie he made? Anyway, he was so alarmed by the potential of autonomous weapons that he produced this movie, Slaughterbots, warning us about that. Now, I absolutely, totally think that's very important. But one thing I just want to raise with you is I was quite surprised, or have been quite surprised by what's been going on in the conflict in Ukraine, that we haven't seen as many slaughterbots or that kind of thing as I would have anticipated, especially as Putin is reputed to have said several years ago, whoever rules AI rules the world. And you would have thought there had been a huge investment already by them in the military side of things. Are you surprised by that at all, or not?
Well, I don't know if Ukraine is the place we're going to see it emerge. Obviously, there's very heavy use of traditional drones that are operated by people, but I think that actually both countries are struggling to produce sufficient quantities of those in some cases really quite rudimentary drones, right? So maybe the drain on our resources is such that they are not able to really spend a lot of time innovating, taking things to the next level. I mean, the fear behind autonomous drones is that you would have a huge number of fully autonomous drones that would swarm, right? And which is what you see in the movie Slaughterbots. And these are actually, the drones depicted in that movie are small, just small, almost like the kind of thing you could buy on Amazon, not huge military drones like you see being used in Ukraine. But definitely, I think that it's inevitable that those technologies are going to come to the forefront. I mean, the United States is working on those technologies. Certainly, China and Russia, to the extent that they have the remaining bandwidth to do development, is working on it as well. So it's probably inevitable that we will see fully autonomous weapons. And the key insight is that no human being can react as quickly as a machine can react, for example, on a battlefield, right? in the book, I make a kind of a comparison to what we see on Wall Street, right? That Wall Street has already been basically taken over by autonomous smart algorithms. And that's, in a sense, a kind of a battlefield. And already, in terms of short-term, the kind of short-term trading that happens, within seconds or minutes, the machines have completely taken over, because there's no way for any human trader to keep up with the ability of these bots, basically, to, for example, read machine readable news stories that are put out by companies like Bloomberg, and then react to that news in some tiny fraction of a second, and place trades, right? So the machines have completely taken over on that battlefield. And I think we're going to see the same thing on real battlefields, where even when you're in kinetic battles, this ability of artificial intelligence to respond instantly, and perhaps unleash an attack is going to be, sort of a game-changing advantage. So it's inevitable that we're moving toward that, and that brings with it real dangers. It's probably the most terrifying danger is that we will create these kind of swarming autonomous weapons, and then those would fall in the hands of terrorists, right, or illegitimate actors, not traditional militaries, and that they could then be used to attack civilians, right? And there's also a general fear, I think, that as we send robots to war, right, and we're not risking human lives, then it becomes easier to go to war. I mean, as I say in the book, many people make the criticism of the United States that now that we have a professional, all volunteer military, right, it's very easy for the elite people in our society who don't send their kids, to join the military, to, send this country to war because they don't have any skin in the game in a certain sense, right? And there have already been criticisms that even the country has involved itself in a great many wars that probably we wouldn't have if the children of the elite were going to be sent into harm's way. And if we move to a future where we aren't selling anyone to war, where it's all just robots, it becomes even easier to do that.
No, I totally agree with that. So let's go perhaps to the question about unemployment, which was the preoccupation with the rise of the robots, and what's become very clear in terms of the headlines in the press is that already alarm bells are beginning to be sounded, especially with the demonstrations in Hollywood, against the potential of being displaced by AI. What do you make of that Hollywood moment, as it were, in terms of employment?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly that, I think that, in particular, ChatGPT really put this issue on the radar and made people realize, the potential for what these technologies are going to do. And it's becoming more clear, I think, that there definitely is going to be an impact on employment. And that's only going to increase as these technologies become more capable. I mean, the central question here, and the thing that I tried to address in Rise of the Robots, is the question, is this time different in terms of this technology? And you'll find many economists that are very skeptical of that, and will always push back against any argument to say that this time is different, right? And it really goes to the economic history, at least since the Industrial Revolution, right? We've seen many times that there have been disruptive technologies that have displaced large numbers of workers, and yet over time, the economy and the job market have adapted, right? And new jobs have been created. And you'll find many economists who will tell you that artificial intelligence is just another technology. It's just another example of that. And there's no particular reason to believe that the outcome is going to be any different than what we've seen in the past. Sort of the classic example that you can point to is the mechanization of agriculture, right? So it used to be that in the United States, and obviously other countries as well, most of the workforce was engaged in farming, right? Most people worked on farms. But then you had the advent of tractors and agricultural machinery, combine harvesters and all of that. And as a result of that, the percentage of our workforce that's engaged in agriculture is now, less than 2%, maybe around 1 to 2%. So there were clearly millions and millions of jobs in agriculture were lost, and there were short-term disruptions as a result of that. Workers lost their jobs on the farms, and they had to move to cities to look for new jobs. But what really happened there is that you saw this essentially mechanization or really automation of the agricultural sector, but at the same time there was a new rising sector, right, which was manufacturing, and manufacturing essentially absorbed all the workers that lost their jobs in agriculture. And then later you saw something similar happen with manufacturing. Manufacturing is also automated and of course offshored as well. And now all those workers have moved to the service sector. And so the question is, can something similar happen now with the introduction of these technologies? And you're seeing both the introduction of artificial intelligence, systems like ChatGPT, they're going to impact white collar jobs. And you're also seeing the introduction of much more advanced robots. Like, for example, Amazon recently announced a robot they call Sparrow, which they claim is really approaching human dexterity in terms of its capability. And my argument is that this is different. This is a systemic general purpose technology that's going to impact everything, every sector of the economy, and it's going to really displace jobs across the board. It doesn't matter if you're working in an Amazon warehouse or you're working in a factory or in an office. In many cases, it won't matter whether you have a college degree or even a graduate degree. The technologies are still going to be able to take over your job, and it's basically going to happen everywhere. So what I would say is that it's not going to be like what we saw with agriculture, because there's not going to be some other emerging sector of the economy that's going to absorb all the workers that lose, their jobs in offices and factories and warehouses and fast food restaurants, and maybe even, jobs like taxi drivers and truck drivers eventually. It's just an enormous impact when you look at the potential for these technologies. And certainly there will be new jobs created. There will be, jobs working with artificial intelligence. There will be jobs maintaining the robots and so forth, yes. But there aren't going to be, in my opinion, sufficient numbers of those jobs to absorb all of the impacted workers. And I also think there's very likely to be a skill mismatch in the sense that, for example, the worker that is now at McDonald's doing fast food work is probably not going to be well equipped to become a robotics engineer or technician, for example. So there's also going to be a problem with moving many of the more routine type jobs, in terms of moving the workers that lose those jobs into new kinds of jobs that might be created as these technologies progress. So my personal opinion is we are going to have a real problem in the future with both unemployment, underemployment, skill mismatch, and de-skilling of jobs, where technology essentially takes a job that once would have required a lot of skill and therefore would have commanded a good wage, and technology comes along that essentially allows any worker at any wage level, or maybe even a gig worker, to do that job, and then a middle class opportunity with good wages and benefits disappears as a result of that. We're seeing a lot of that already. So I think there's going to be enormous impact on the job market.
No, and I completely agree with your logic in your book, especially the fact that you point out that it's not just blue collar workers, it's white collar workers. I think the dominant impression was that you've seen Tesla factories and we don't see many people there. It was going to be there, and we thought that maybe white collar workers would be more safe. But I think even computer scientists are sounding the alarm now that GPT systems seem to be able to write code that in the future, even those kind of jobs would be at risk.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, in many cases, I think the opposite could be true. In the sense that to automate a white collar job, you just need software, right? You need something an artificial intelligence system like ChatGPT and so forth, you don't need an expensive mechanical robot, right? So in many cases, what we're seeing is that the safest jobs may actually be jobs that do require some level of manipulation of the environment. For example, skilled trade jobs like electricians and plumbers are probably, the hardest jobs to automate for the foreseeable future. You would need, in order to automate what a plumber does, you would need C-3PO from Star Wars, right? You would need a genuinely science fiction level robot to do that, and that's something that we're still not close to. So I think a plumber or an electrician is much safer in terms of their career than a much more educated financial analyst, for example, sitting in a cubicle somewhere in front of a computer, right? And that's going to be, I think, one of the hard truths that many, highly educated professional workers are going to have to come to realize.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a study that was done at the University of Oxford in 2013, where they went through all these different professions. And from telemarketeers whose jobs have already gone, right through to to other jobs that require more of kind of personal sense of contact. And I think there are about 8. You familiar with that particular study?
Yeah. And basically, the key insight there is that jobs that are more routine and predictable and in nature are going to be much more susceptible. And in many jobs, of course, there's a mix. It's really not about jobs, it's about tasks. And so what you'll see as this develops is, it's not the case necessarily that there's going to be a robot or an algorithm that is going to completely displace a worker in a particular job. Like there's going to be a one-to-one correspondence between the work that's now being done by a person and the work that's going to be done by automation in the future. Instead, what happens is that portions of the job can be automated. And so work is going to get reorganized, right? So that the parts of the jobs that are more routine are going to be taken over by algorithms or by robots. And then people will continue to do the less routine work or the work that cannot yet be automated. But what that means is that essentially the boundaries between jobs are going to shift, and workplaces are going to be reorganized, and the job titles are going to change. And some people who are now doing work are going to lose their jobs, and there'll be a different job, but it might be a job that requires a different skill set, so they'll hire a different person into that job. And overall, I think there will be consolidation, right? Imagine you've got 2 workers doing essentially the same kind of job, and half of each of those jobs can be automated. And so clearly, management at some point is going to look at that, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to automate 50% of each of these jobs. And what's left is no longer 2 jobs. Now it's just 1 job, right? And it may be an entirely different kind of job, and it may require a different person to do that job. But in general, we're going to see a consolidation where there are fewer workers and more, reliance on AI and robotics.
Maybe I could just address the question to the creative industries, shall we call them, which obviously include architecture. I mean, my first point would be this. It seems to me the limitation of the Oxford study was doing a 1-for-1 comparison, humans versus AI. Whereas I think what you're outlining in Rule of the Robots is actually the kind of collaborative side of things. These factories where the dexterity required is still done by humans, but the robots are bringing everything to the worker and so on. So it's always been a kind of combination of that. And one of the my critiques of the Oxford study would be that really what we should be doing is not making a comparison of AI versus humans, but rather humans using AI versus humans not using AI. And I mean, who knows precisely how you could calculate that? Because in any profession, there are different, as you say, different tasks, and certainly in architecture, there's a huge range of those things. But nonetheless, I think in some senses, the principle holds true. And of course, the other question is when, maybe now it's one situation, but what's going to be like in 10 years' time? But I want to just sound you out on that kind of question, because, I've heard the argument made that that say on certain particular tasks, one person using AI could do the job of, say, 5 not using AI. Is that something you would entertain as a logic for understanding employment, the threat of unemployment?
Yes, I think that there's clearly going to be collaboration, but the level of collaboration versus displacement is going to be different for different professions and different types of work, right? If you're well, take the extreme example, if you drive Uber, right, and someday we really do have robotic taxis, then you're not going to be collaborating, right? You're going to be out of a job, and so that would be an example of absolute displacement, right? Whereas I think if you're an architect or a research scientist or a more creative worker, at least for the foreseeable future, artificial intelligence is likely to be more of a tool that you're going to utilize. I think it will make astounding changes to the profession. I mean, I think architects, for example, are generally trained in drawing, right? You can draw renditions of buildings and stuff. My guess is that's going to go away, right? You're going to begin to rely on AI to produce all that kinds of output. I think that the nature of what an architect does may shift to largely be a conversation with something like a chat GPT. I mean, you can imagine having a conversation between a machine and maybe an architect and maybe a client about some future project. And it's really just a conversation. And as you're doing this in real time, the AI will generate, renditions of projects, of buildings or structures. You can imagine, virtual reality coming into it, so that the AI is almost instantaneously generating not just a drawing, but an environment that you can actually, virtually walk through and be inside the building, and all of this is happening almost instantaneously, right? So you can obviously see the dramatic boost in productivity that's going to come from this in professions like architecture, right, where all of the nuts and bolts stuff like producing drawings and blueprints and all of that architects used to be involved with is just going to be completely automated. And that may create, opportunities for different kinds of architects, right? For the truly creative individual that can utilize these tools, it will be an enormous boost to productivity. But if you're maybe the architect that is focused more on the rudimentary type stuff, you're much more likely to get displaced, right? And this is the same in other professions like law, right? If you're a lawyer, if you're the courtroom lawyer, or the lawyer that's dreaming up, new creative approaches to the legal system, the AI is going to be a powerful tool. If you're the lawyer that is just doing case research and cranking out briefs or cranking out contracts, all of that stuff is going to be highly susceptible to automation. So I think within every profession, there are going to be far more opportunities for more creative individuals, or the individuals that have connections so that they bring in business, the rainmakers. Those people are going to do well. But if you're the person that's sitting in front of a computer doing rudimentary, repetitive kind of work, you have good reasons to worry about what the impact of AI is going to be.
No, absolutely. And I think, in some senses, the way that I see the dark side of AI is not necessarily there's anything evil about AI, but rather that it is so astonishingly capable. And we get these new things happening that we hadn't quite imagined. I should just mention just briefly that we have in the audience today Wan Yu Ho, who is the CEO of the leading AI software company for architects. And she is working on a system that ultimately will be dealing with things in a much more in-depth manner than what's been happening so far. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment in terms of architectural practices is the use of these diffusion models such as Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on, which are able to kind of throw out these ideas, and they become a kind of prompts in some ways to us. We write the prompt, but it produces prompts and suggestions, and therefore it extends the possibility of what we can do. But long run, there are going to be other systems that are going to come into place which are going to be automating the entire process, which of course is a fantastic thing on one level. It'll make life much easier, but therein comes the particular challenge. And I really want to sort of pick up on that issue a little bit, in the sense that I think you rightly make that point that you've just mentioned again, that in the book you make the point that actually the trouble is that what is there to go into if we lose jobs in one domain? Where is the next area we can move into? And I think you're rightly saying, well, I'm not sure there are any other areas to move into. And that becomes an issue in architecture. And I think one of the things I would say is that, and you also focus on economics a lot. I think that is fantastic, the strength of the book itself. But from an economic perspective, my hunch of what might happen, and this is partly to do with what we've seen happen in China already, is that as it becomes easier, and it is becoming easier for sure, even now, we haven't reached the full kind of engagement with AI, but as it becomes easier, so smaller practices can do much more than they could in the past, and maybe take on the big practices. You could even have a small architectural firm doing a city and so on, which then sort of raises the kind of question that as things get tough, is there not going to be some kind of fee bargaining going on? In other words, that people are reducing the rates because they can do much more. The reason I ask this is because in China, we've already seen a kind of shift from, I mean, just to give a ballpark figure, from what used to be about 5% architects make money out of from buildings based on the cost of construction. That's the way that they've been paid, or we've been paid in the past. Now, as you move forward, and as you find that maybe a small group can do far more, and as things get desperate, there's likely to be a kind of a bartering process in terms of fees, whereby the fees drop down from, let's say, 5% down to 2%, or that kind of thing. And we've seen that in China anyway, even without AI. So my concern would be that, where is the money coming from? I mean, you can say, people sort of say, well, okay, we don't have to do this mechanical task, we can invest in other things. But once you get this bartering process, whereby the fee, the only conduit of income into the profession, once that starts being reduced, then the overall money into the profession is being reduced. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a concern for every profession. Basically, as automation increases the capability and reduces costs, that's going to be reflected in what you can build, right? I mean, the other thing that happens here is that artificial intelligence could start out as a tool for architects that greatly enhances your capability and your ability to do things for a client. But at the end, maybe especially for simpler projects, artificial intelligence could become a tool for the client, right? And now the client can completely, eliminate the architect, right? Because the technology becomes so capable. And in the same way that TurboTax eliminates the need for a tax professional to do your taxes, right? So that's the concern going forward in terms of the creative professions. I think that I mean, obviously, if we do reach that level where we have true human level artificial intelligence, right? Then in theory, it's hard to think of a job that can't be automated, right? I mean, and especially if, as most computer scientists believe, once we have human level intelligence, it will very rapidly become superhuman in terms of its intelligence. So there'll be a machine out there that is smarter than any of us, right? And also maybe more affordable, scalable, and can virtually do anything. So at that point, it's really hard to think of a job that will be safe for a human being, right? So that's maybe a future that we have to think about. And it's obviously not just about one profession, about like architecture. It's our whole economy, our whole social contract, our whole society, right? In terms of, in a certain sense, it brings into question, what does it mean to be human, right? Because, I mean, all of you, if you're in the architecture profession, I'm sure your job is incredibly important to your identity as a human being, right? And the way you think of yourself and what you contribute to the world, right? Your sense of self-esteem and so forth is all tied up in your profession, right? What if someday that kind of goes away, right? What do we do then, right? For Those are just enormously important and questions that we might someday have to confront.
I totally agree. I want to go back to something you comment that came out of the rise of the robots, where I mean, importantly, what you do is you introduce time into the whole thing. Like you can see the immediate benefits of these particular technologies, but it's a long-term impact where those benefits may turn to be the dark side, as it were, of what's happening. I think what I found interesting is you had this kind of story where you talk about this invasion of aliens, and they kind of recently, this last week, I don't know if you saw it, but Yuval Harari has been talking about this in a very similar way. This kind of it's as though there are these aliens coming in from outer space who could do all these things, and I personally made reference to that in my particular book. But the point being is that you've got a situation whereby it begins to shift and change, and I think the analysis in Rise of the Robots about how that incredibly useful tool could then impact things, because all these consequences fall into place is the most important contribution that I've seen coming about unemployment. Do you want to comment on that? How the good can turn into the bad in some sense. It's so useful that it can also displace people.
Right. I mean, the key insight here is that our economy is based on it's a market economy that is dependent on a balance of supply and demand, right? So you can easily imagine, as these technologies advance, and think of some far future scenario, you can easily imagine a fully automated economy, right, where all the work is done by machines, and human beings don't have to do anything. We can just spend our time doing whatever we want. That's fine. But the way our economy is structured currently, the income that we use to purchase things that create demand for products and services comes from jobs, right? People get income from a job, and then they go out and spend that. And as they spend, that's what creates the demand for the products that are being produced. So there's kind of a cycle there where you can think of purchasing power flowing from producers to consumers through the mechanism of jobs primarily, and then flowing back from consumers to producers as those consumers spend the money. And that cycle is what drives our market economy, right? But obviously, if you fully automate everything and no one has a job anymore, then no one has any money to spend, right? So the whole thing kind of collapses. And so, I mean, that's a very simple observation, which is obviously correct. I mean, it's, you can't argue with it. So the question is, what would we do in that scenario? And the obvious answer is that there has to be some other mechanism to replace jobs, right? That gets money back from producers to consumers. And one possibility would be something like a universal basic income, right? Where the government taxes, the factories and the companies that are producing things, and takes that money and just gives it to consumers so that they in turn can go out and buy the things being produced, right? Otherwise, everything just kind of comes to a halt. So that's the central insight of the problem with this. If it really gets extreme and we begin having large numbers of people that are disenfranchised from the job market.
And I guess the point that the Hollywood actors made is actually that in some ways it's not AI so much, it's the people who are employing them trying to save money by using AI. We had a recent case in LA where there was a copywriter who was writing the text for a startup, and they discovered that actually ChatGPT could do it much more efficiently, much better, and of course for free, effectively. So in a way, it was the people in charge looking to sort of to cut costs. They were the ones who were responsible for introducing the change. Does your thinking concur with that?
Yeah, but I mean, that's a natural phenomenon within capitalism, right? I mean, the problem is that you can complain, oh, one person did this, but it's inevitable that someone will do it, and then everyone has to do it, right, in order to remain competitive. Just as though, I mean, you were talking about the fees in architecture, right? If some architects employ these technologies, and as a result of that can reduce their fees, then all the other architects become uncompetitive, right? So they have to do the same thing. So that's essentially how it's going to work. So I think, short of making these technologies illegal, right, outlawing them, there's no way to stop that. That's a natural phenomenon within the market economy, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that the Suskins make a kind of similar point. I don't know if you know their work, but I'm very taken by that. And what is interesting, you put their approach and your approach, it comes side by side, and you're, having the CEO in Silicon Valley approach it from the business point of view with someone familiar with the technology. And theirs, in some senses, more academic, but they work well together, these theses. And I mean, I think the idea of the Suskins is the professions as such are going to break down, because this kind of gentleman's agreement, as it were, the grand bargain that allowed architects to police things and so on, will break down. It'll be economic forces that will be the driver of change. That seems to be the strongest argument. I find that very persuasive. The idea, in the end, it is going to be economics that is going to be driving change.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. I mean, definitely, these technologies are going to have an enormous economic impact, both in terms of their ability to increase productivity, but also in terms of their ability to eliminate a lot of work. And I think we're just now, the general public is beginning to see that. But over the course of the next decade or so, I think that these issues are going to become much more obvious, and we're going to have to begin to find ways to address these issues.
So I just want to invite those in the audience to send in some questions, also those, both the YouTube audience and also the Zoom audience, and we'll be moving on to those questions just shortly. I want to finish off though with one particular kind of concern that relates to architecture in the sense, or the creative industries, and that is to say that in that Oxford study, which I think is problematic in certain ways, but it did position the architecture as a creative industry as being relatively immune from the changes that are going to happen. I think out of the 700, 800 professions, it was something like 70th or 80th or something like that. So it's relatively safe, according to them. But I'm wondering whether, in fact, that is quite the way that it's going to turn out. I mean, what's become very clear to us, certainly many of us have been playing around with, shall we say, the world of Midjourney and DALL-E, and discovering that the mind-blowing capacity of this system to generate thoughts, ideas, prompts, and proposals, and so on, that kind of suggest, on the one hand, that it kind of, in a sense, parallel to Stephen Wolfram's argument that ChatGPT shows us how language is actually more straightforward than we thought. But maybe these are showing us that creativity, we held to be a very mysterious and very special attribute of artists, architects, and things, might actually be more straightforward than we think. And it's kind of showing us up, I would say. It's showing us up in the sense it's providing us with ideas that just beyond our spectrum. And it seems to me one of the limitations, in fact, of architects on writers and so on. We think that we have this amazing range of possibilities, but actually, when it comes down to it, it's fairly limited. And what these systems are doing are just throwing out many different options that we wouldn't have thought about. So in some sense, it's highlighting as you say, it becomes a reflection on the human beings in the end. It's highlighting the limitations of our own creativity. Would you agree with that approach?
Yes, I mean, what I would generally say is that a creative profession like architecture, for currently and I think for the foreseeable future, I think you're fairly safe. I think that these technologies are going to be a powerful tool rather than something that can displace you. But at the same time, the strongest thing that I really emphasized is that AI is dynamic, right? This is the state of affairs right now, but these technologies are going to get dramatically better over the coming years and decades. And so that calculation could change, right? And it could become the case that more of what you do could be automated. I think, in general, architects need to integrate a lot of knowledge from different areas, right? Contrast that with a graphic designer, right? And you've already seen these generative AI systems like Midjourney being used to displace graphic designers, right? Because what they're doing is very simple. Just take a an idea, a sentence, a description, and then put it into graphical form, right? And that we have seen, in fact, that the machines are already, capable of that, right? So I think you will see more displacement in creative activities like graphic design, where it's more simple. But what architects do is much more complex than that, right? You need knowledge from many different areas in order to do what you do. So, and that's what I think makes you safe currently, right? But at some point, as these technologies progress and you see, for example, obviously companies building specific AI systems geared toward architecture that do have increasing ability to integrate knowledge and information from different domains, that could change, certainly. And the thing is, no one can say how fast that's going to happen. I couldn't tell you it's going to be 10 years or 20 years or 5 years. I mean, it's remarkable how fast these technologies are developing, and I think that the impact is for any given profession or any given facet of the economy is going to be entirely unpredictable.
Like maybe I'll just share with you one experience I had from interviewing various people for my last book, and that's to say, I mean, as you say, rightly say, architecture involves many different tasks, shall we say, and it's also a strange combination of a very kind of logical, rational kind of calculation, shall we say, in terms of getting maximum floor area, all those kind of things, and an aesthetic about making it look good. But it's the former, the kind of the dealing with complex data and analyzing it and trying to sort of come up with a solution that is the most efficient, which is the most interesting in some ways. And we already saw in the capability of, as you know, AlphaGo and all these stories whereby AI was able to assimilate all this information and come up with solutions we wouldn't have thought of. The famous move 37 in game 2, for example, none of the Go players they were all shocked by that. And that's also been happening in architectural practices, which is kind of interesting, is that, especially when you're dealing with a complex urban situation where there are many factors to be taken on board, and the capacity for a machine to work its way through that data, to see patterns and clusters and so on, really supersedes architects. And there was one particular case where they used one of these systems, and it came up with a solution that no architect would have thought about. It came up with this solution that no architect would have thought about, but nonetheless, it was a much more efficient solution. And what this particular practice, which has now been bought up by Autodesk, it's now called Forma, but originally it was called Spacemaker. What they found was that clients were beginning to insist that people used AI. And to my mind, that's possibly for two reasons. One, you can maximize the return on your investment because you get the most efficient solution. But also, human beings make mistakes, and increasingly we're seeing less mistakes in these AI systems. Do you see that as being a kind of factor in terms of employment?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think that the idea that many professions, maybe every profession, you're going to collaborate with AI is inevitable. I've talked, for example, about medicine. I think the day will come when it will be considered malpractice for a doctor to diagnose a disease or decide on a treatment without having a conversation with an AI system, which will encapsulate really the very best of medical practice, right? An AI system can encapsulate the knowledge and the judgment of the very best doctors, right, in the world, and that knowledge and expertise will become available to every doctor. Okay? Because I mean, there are good doctors and bad doctors, right? If you're unlucky and you don't have a great doctor, you'll still be, you'll have access to the top experts of the world. And I'm sure that the same will be true of architecture, right? Where it will become part of general professional practice to rely on AI systems. But that doesn't necessarily mean that architects will be displaced, right? The question is, at what point can you literally get rid of the architect? And as I said, it's unclear when that would happen. And maybe for smaller projects, you might see that begin to happen, but not for more larger, complex projects or something like that. And of course, there are also regulations. Certainly in medicine, the idea of getting rid of doctors entirely is in many ways hard to imagine because there are so many regulations and liability around this. And I think there are also regulations involving architects and civil engineers and so forth as well, right? So that will probably provide some level of protection.
Yeah, maybe just one final point on this before we move on to the question. That is to say that the idea of regulations, of course, in architecture, there are regulations already that are part of what we deal with in terms of coding, of building regulations, and so on. What interestingly, that's what's happening in architecture, and the kind of software that's been developed by companies like LookX and so on, is that is being seen to be increasingly will be embedded in the process, whereby you're designing something, it won't let you do something that is contravening planning regulations. In other words, you've got this system that is potentially, I think, guarding against mistakes in some senses. And that is one way to think about how AI is going to operate. In some sense, it's going to be a bit of like spell check writ large. It's going to not only kind of tell us the spelling has gone wrong, but also potentially to fact check things. And I just wanted to sort of bounce that off you. That maybe the discussion about fakes and things could also be addressed by AI in the sense that maybe AI could detect a fake, and that therefore it becomes more of a safeguard than a risk as such, especially when you're trying to pick up on not only fakes but also mistakes that are being made, that AI could be there as a way of protecting us in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's, the world of AI is going to be, kind of similar to what you see with viruses, right? Where you've got, black hat bad people creating computer viruses, and you've got the white hat people who are, creating systems to defend against computer viruses. And you're going to see the same thing, in AI with things like deep fakes and fabrications and misinformation, right? Where you've got two battling sides. Both of which, of course, will employ artificial intelligence. And that's going to be a continuous battle. But, based on what the experts have said, is that it's probably going to be very difficult for the white hat, the people that are trying to defend us against these things to keep up with in this arms race, because, artificial intelligence can also be used to overcome any systems they put in place to try to detect fakes or generally enhance security. And there are other approaches being looked at, things like watermarks and images that verify their fidelity and so forth. But it's a big problem. I mean, there's a real concern that we're going to enter a world where what you see and hear is not necessarily real, right? And this has enormous implications in many, many areas. I mean, think of the legal system where you could have, images or videos or audio recordings presented to a jury, and there might be ultimately no way to know for sure whether that's real or was it fabricated. So how we deal with these issues in many different domains is going to be a real challenge, I think.
So I'd like to just open up now to questions from the audience, and we've got a question from Kevin McClelland. How can legislation, per the meeting that Biden had with Musk, Zuckerberg, etc., be used to manage these concerns within the different disciplines? I mean, you touch on this in your book about how do you introduce safeguards and so on. But
right. I think the general idea here is that, I'm generally against regulating AI research itself or trying to pause it or anything like that, because you have heard people like Musk and some others talk about, there should be a 6-month moratorium on this research. I mean, I think that's kind of pointless. First of all, 6 months is going to go by very fast. Secondly, China probably isn't going to sign on to that, right? And the last thing we want is really to fall behind the Chinese in terms of these technologies, because there are enormously important national security implications for the use of artificial intelligence. What we clearly need to do, though, is to regulate applications of AI, right? So once you're going to take AI out of the laboratory and begin to apply it in the real world, then there's going to be a need for regulation. And in many areas, this exists already, right? Self-driving cars, where AI intersects with places that there's already regulatory apparatus, then it does tend to be regulated, right? So self-driving cars are regulated by the Department of Transportation, and medical uses of artificial intelligence can be regulated by the FDA, right? But there are many gaps in the systems. There are many areas where there isn't sufficient regulation. For example, I mentioned earlier that there is a use of artificial intelligence in the criminal justice system. And we've seen cases where the algorithms used are racially biased. Companies use artificial intelligence to screen resumes, right? Determine between these candidates we have sending their resumes in, which ones do we want to bring in for interviews and pursue it further. And those screening systems have been shown in some cases to be biased, for example, on the basis of gender. So clearly that's not an acceptable state of affairs. So there has to be some sort of system that can regulate, those kinds of high stakes uses of artificial intelligence and make sure it is being done fairly. So what I suggest in the book is that we probably need a dedicated agency, something like an FDA or an FAA that is dedicated to artificial intelligence, so that you have the kind of expertise within the government. And granted, it may be kind of a revolving door, like many other agencies, where you see people moving back and forth between industry and government within this agency to try to create the kind of regulations that we need, to govern this technology. The point is that the AI is so complicated, so hard to understand, and most importantly is advancing so rapidly that I don't think there's any way that you can regulate it with direct regulation in Congress or in other countries in parliaments. I mean, because those politicians don't have the necessary expertise, right? And they can't act quickly enough. So you need something like the SEC, right? That regulates financial transactions. You need something like that for AI, I think, where you've got people in-house that have the necessary expertise that can develop regulations where they are needed.
No, I think the important point you make is, how do you regulate? How do you get this across? I mean, internally within a particular country, you can no doubt do that. But how do you, for example, we can't stop Putin invading Ukraine. So how are we going to stop Putin in terms of AI development, doing certain things we don't approve of? That seems to be the crucial issue.
Right. I mean, I think that that's a real important question. I think most regulation of artificial intelligence is going to be within countries. Each country will have to decide, for example, what's it going to allow in terms of facial recognition systems. Obviously, in China, they're building a truly Orwellian state, right? We don't want that in the United States, but we will nonetheless utilize these technologies. So each country is going to have to make trade-offs there in terms of what they allow. In terms of the bigger issue like autonomous weapons, there is an initiative in the United Nations to outlaw autonomous weapons in the same way that, for example, chemical weapons are outlawed. But the most important countries, the US, China, Russia, have not signed on to that, right? And I suspect the reason they have not signed on is that there's a lack of trust there, right? That if the United States stops all development on these weapons, then they don't trust that the Chinese and the Russians will also stop, right? And the reality is that the autonomous weapons will deliver enormous advantages, right, on the battlefield. So countries really can't afford not to at least do research into these areas. So it's a real problem in terms of global regulation in the world that we live in today. It seems very likely that to some extent there is going to be an AI arms race, right? Where you've got different countries competing to advance the frontier. And in many cases in applications that are quite dangerous. It's not clear what the solution to that is.
No, so I think the question of competition is very kind of important. Not only competition internally, you think, well, if I mean, to my mind, the idea of pausing things is a bit like asking the leaders in the Olympic marathon to slow down a bit. They're not going to do it because their competitors will catch up. But we've already seen how kind of to be too cautious, you're kind of giving away your competitors, and the fact that Google didn't release Palm at the early stage, they were concerned about the safety of certain things, but actually maybe you should throw yourself into it and risk things, and a bit like the way that Tesla does with the self-driving car to make it sort of work. And we've obviously we can see competition between different countries. Absolutely, that's crucial. Maybe just one quick comment about it is the Tesla car thing is something I think one of the most important points that you raise, that they allow the system to go on the road, taking a certain risk, but they get benefits from the data they're getting in from that.
Right. Tesla has got an enormous advantage because they have got, a huge number of Teslas on the road throughout the world. And these cars are driving on real roads, and they are collecting enormous amounts of data, especially photographs of the environment. So Tesla has got just this enormous, basically, database of information that they've gathered as these cars drive, and they can actually use that to train their algorithms to become better and better. So that's the positive side of what they're doing. But I also think there's a very real negative side in terms of the way they approach it. They upgrade their self-driving system and allow drivers to basically download it, and instantly their cars become more capable. I think is quite dangerous. I mean, I think that it's fine to beta test your software if your software is a video game, right? And people are going to use it in the real world and find the bugs, and you're going to fix it. That's fine. But if it's a machine that can run people over, then it's not so good to do that, right? So I do think that they should be more cautious, and you see a stark contrast between the approach that Tesla is taking and the approach that, for example, Waymo is taking, where they're much more cautious in terms of what they release to the world. I've been a bit surprised that there have been a number of accidents, including fatal accidents with Tesla cars, and yet still we haven't really seen this backlash against them over this. But it's very clear that they, are dramatically overselling what they call their self-driving system. They call it autopilot, right? Which really implies that it's a system that can drive the car by itself, and that simply is not true. It's really an assistive system that needs to have a driver there and engaged all the time. So I mean, that's a real issue, and it's somewhat surprising to me that the government hasn't actually stepped in more aggressively to sort of rein in what they're doing there.
And of course, there's the problem in the end of when they do become competent, what happens to human drivers. There's a comment I think that's made that Toby Walsh eventually will be banned from driving because we will make more mistakes than cars eventually.
Yeah, eventually that day will come, and that will mean that a whole lot of jobs for people that drive Ubers and delivery vehicles and trucks and all the rest could also evaporate. That would be millions of jobs right there.
So let's move on to a question from Vasco, who is in Bangladesh, just showing you who's listening all around the world. Just to say that the reason why we start so early is that's when we can capture the most of the audience around the world. It's the time that most people are awake. So Vasco's question is, in your books, you discuss the concentration of power among tech giants. How can we strike a balance between fostering innovation and preventing the undue influence of a few companies in shaping the AI landscape? That's a very nice question.
I think to some extent that's going to happen automatically because artificial intelligence is being democratized. The tools to deploy it are getting much better, as we've seen over the last year. Artificial intelligence is deployed in the cloud, so basically everyone can access it. Companies, will have, the biggest impact of AI is not so much going to be clearly the companies that create it and are able to develop it and sell it are going to generate a lot of income and become powerful. That's true. But the real impact is going to be in all the other companies that deploy it within their business models. And I think that's clearly being democratized. I mean, it's going to be available to everyone. It is, as I argue in the book, it's becoming like electricity. So it's not going to be a resource that only certain people have access to. It's going to be something that everyone can access to in the same way that I've got a chat GPT app on my phone, right, that I can use. So I do think that will counterbalance things to a certain extent, but it is going to probably remain the case that artificial intelligence, as it currently is configured, it takes enormous resources in order to be at the frontier in terms of the talent of the people that you have to hire, who are commanding salaries almost like sports stars, and even more so the compute power that's required, right? It just takes an enormous amounts of computational resources in order to train these large language models. And so what that means is that it is probably going to be a fairly limited number of players that are really able to continue to work in that field. But there are several of them, so there's going to be intensive competition between them.
I guess also in the rule of law, you look at the whole economic question, and we're already seeing a kind of disparity between the wealth being generated by these high-tech companies and at the bottom end, the kind of the bullshit jobs, as it were, and how they're struggling. And it seems that is going to be exacerbated by these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. That I believe that if we don't counterbalance it, artificial intelligence is going to be a very powerful force to increase inequality, right? That there are going to be an ever smaller number of more wealthy people at the top, people that have the necessary skills to work with these technologies, and especially people that own lots of capital, right? Including, owning large investments in these companies that are creating these technologies. Those people are going to become extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, whereas the vast majority of people who rely, their main asset is their labor, right? Their labor is how they generate their income and how they survive. Those people are going to be increasingly disenfranchised, and that's why the argument I'm making in the book is that we need to, make policy decisions to begin to address this before it becomes even more extreme.
So there's another question that's kind of related to this that's in the chat from Alan Crawford. Will the gradual rise of AI in all aspects of work signal the demise of larger corporations and boost the increase of smaller to mid-sized companies, or the opposite? Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to know that. Certainly, as I said, within the technology industry, the companies that are actually creating these technologies, there does currently seem to be a very, very significant return to scale, right? A company like Google has at its disposal, incomprehensible levels of compute power, right? And that is crucial to developing these technologies. So certainly within the technology industry, I don't think there's any that I can see anything that's going to cause these big companies to break up into smaller entities. I mean, I think that the prevailing forces are just the opposite. In other industries, as artificial intelligence is deployed, maybe in some instances the story could be different. It's hard to say. It might be a bit more unpredictable. But in general, I think that larger companies with greater scale, greater access to computing resources are probably going to be an advantage to deploy artificial intelligence as well.
So we've got a question. You actually got some very eminent figures in the audience here. Wan Yu He is the leading software developer, I would say, in the world at the moment for architects. And she's got it's kind of a similar question. Let me read it out to you anyway. If the AI will be controlled only by a few capital groups, what will happen? How can this be avoided as a potential problem? Sounds like umbrella cooperation in sci-fi already. I don't know that reference to umbrella cooperation, but yeah.
Right. Again, when you say control the technology, what do you mean? I mean, it's true that certain companies develop it and own it and are able to realize the financial benefits of that. But these technologies are widely dispersed, right? And everyone can use them. So OpenAI created ChatGPT, but I have ChatGPT. I have access to it on my phone, so I can use it to do all kinds of things, as can you. So what does controlling it really mean? You know, AI is going to continue to develop it and enhance it and make it more powerful, but it's all the countless people out there that will actually have access to this technology and can use it, right? It's not like OpenAI is hiding the technology and only they have access to it. They're making it available to everyone, right? So I think it's kind of a complicated story there. Clearly, AI is becoming the new electricity, and everyone is going to have access to that resource. And I think most of the value that's going to come from artificial intelligence is not going to be the value of creating it and selling it. It's going to be the value that's created when you deploy it in your particular business or your industry, right? And that's going to be widely available.
Maybe I just, why don't you just put a follow-up question in the chat? OpenAI can answer questions with certain directions and influence people. That's as a kind of counter argument. So it does have a certain control. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is true, and that might be one reason why you want competing companies, as there are, right? I mean, Google is going to release a competitor to ChatGPT, right? And there's going to be an intense battle between those companies. I mean, some of the issues there that there are political considerations there. I think politically conservative people in the United States would complain that these algorithms are woke or something like that, right? That they probably have a bias in certain instances, and there are definitely going to be issues there. I mean, it's the most dramatic example of that is in China, right, where the Chinese companies are developing their own versions of ChatGPT. There was recently an article in The Economist that I tweeted that said that the system in China says that COVID originated in the United States, and those are the kind of answers you'll get if you engage with those systems, right? So yes, these systems are going to be susceptible to biases that are perhaps intentionally introduced by governments or by companies, and that's an issue that we're also going to have to deal with.
Maybe I could, you're familiar, I know, because you wrote about in Kai-Fu Lee's book, comparing China with the States, AI superpowers. And his prediction basically is China will triumph in the end. You pick up on his comment about the Sputnik moment also in terms of the AlphaGo match, which I thought was interesting. And his prediction that the Chinese model is actually going to be more effective. But at the same time, one thing that's become very clear is that China didn't have the advantage of OpenAI in the first place, which has proved to be a real game changer in the West. And secondly, once you've got a system that is cutting off access through the kind of firewall to certain, like Google and so on, you cannot use Google without a VPN in China, and using a VPN has become increasingly difficult. It seems that actually maybe Kai-Fu Lee's prediction might not be as accurate as it seemed at the time. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that his book is a bit outdated now after the advent of ChatGPT and the rise of large language models. I think his central argument certainly has some weight. What he's saying is that China has got enormous amounts of data, just because they've got such a huge population. They've got so many people using smartphones. their payment system is much more digitized than ours is. You know, everyone uses ChatGPT for everything, or I'm sorry, WeChat for virtually everything. And at the same time, they've also got an army of engineers that can do kind of pragmatic nuts and bolts things. They aren't necessarily the world's leading AI researchers, but they're very competent engineers that can build useful systems using all of this data. And that's kind of the advantage that he sees them having. And I think that that continues to be the case. But certainly the advent of the large language models and the disruption of ChatGPT does begin to show how important it is to have, you know, this openness and this, you know, the Chinese government has really cracked down hard on the development of large language models in China, because of course they cannot have a system like ChatGPT that can, you know, give correct answers to questions that people ask in China, right? Because those answers are often not something that the Communist Party wants people to know about. So there's a very heavy level of censorship on these models, and that definitely is going to impact the ability of those companies to be competitive. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But I do think that China is going to continue to be, you know, one of the world's leading developers of AI and probably our main competition. Of course, the other thing that's happened also is that the US has now put restrictions on the technology that is available to technology. Most importantly, the most advanced computer chips that are used in artificial intelligence, you know, from companies like NVIDIA, right? So that also is going to have a big impact on China's ability to compete.
No, absolutely. I think you've nailed it there. We've got a question from DT Zachariah, who is Indian, but doing a doctorate based in France. It is great to hear your thinking about preparing for the disruption in the market economy, rethinking universal basic income for one. Do you have any thoughts about transitioning into an AI-powered economy akin to green transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's sort of the purpose of the books that I wrote. When I wrote Rise of the Robots, I mean, that was my intention, was to begin thinking about that. And I wrote an even earlier book way back in 2009 called Lights in the Tunnel, which also struggled with that question. So I've been trying to kind of put this out there, and I think it will become an incredibly important conversation going forward. I will tell you that I'm a bit pessimistic in terms of our ability to have any kind of a smooth transition. I mean, history has shown very clearly that, you know, throughout the world and certainly in the United States, we do big, dramatic, radical things only when we're in a crisis, right? I mean, if you look at the programs we have in the US now, things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, all of these things basically arose out of the Great Depression, the experience of the Great Depression, right? It was that massive, almost existential crisis in the United States that, you know, created the motivation to create these programs, to create these safety nets that we now all kind of take for granted. But before that, they didn't exist. And I think that, you know, it's easy to talk about a basic income. It's a good thing that more people are discussing it. But the reality is that politically, it's just an extraordinarily radical step to take. And it's something that is almost, you know, in almost every country, even in countries that are more politically, you know, left-leaning than the United States, it still has never happened, not on a national scale, and it's still considered a very, very radical idea. And I think that in order for us to really begin to adopt initiatives like this, we probably are going to have to get into a real crisis. So I think that as these forces develop and AI progresses, if we really do get into a situation where we begin to see extensive technological unemployment, and that has a really big impact on society and on the economy, that'll probably be the point at which we begin to really embrace these ideas, and it becomes politically possible, you know, to begin to see these things take place.
which is interesting because I mean, basically, you have to see things country by country. I mean, in China, to some extent, the regrettable move has seemed to shift away from these high-tech corporations, in some senses, to try and control them. You know, Alibaba, Jack Ma, and so on. There's been a kind of clamping down on that, and then a kind of resurgence of an ideological argument that seems to be. Maybe that's holding China back at the moment. In the States, I think that there is a very different situation. You know, the kind of suspicion of any socialist logic of a safety net is going to hamper the states in being able to move forward, let's say, in the way that Europe does. I mean, you know, I come from a country, UK, where we have free healthcare. You know, there are countries in Europe and Germany where education is almost free. And these things are taken for granted. But, you know, in the States, we're a long way from that in the States.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be country by country, and the political system will, you know, make a big difference. But, you know, even in America, you recall in our last presidential election, we had Andrew Yang, right, who was a Democratic candidate who was out there advocating for a universal basic income. So clearly, this is a topic that's beginning to get on the radar in a way that it wasn't previously. And I think that will become more and more the case going forward.
There's a question in the chat from the Digital Futures team. I think that must be Michael, who's in Berlin. Michael, would you like to ask you a question?
Yes, Neil, thank you. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Neil, for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I mean, okay, a couple of things. I mean, there's so many things that come to mind, but one thing I was just going to mention on a side note, because we talked earlier about this notion of more, let's say, embodied ways of learning. There was a really great conference at NYU earlier this year in March on the philosophy of deep learning, and there was a debate called "Do language models need sensory grounding for meaning and understanding?" organized by Ned Block and Dave Chalmers. So if anyone interested in diving a bit deeper in this topic, it's pretty technical, but it is maybe a reference that some might find useful. However, the actual point I wanted to make here on this notion of grounding, from a design perspective, let's say, what I think is potentially, I'm not sure if it's a danger, but something that concerns me in a way, or I'd like to think about it a bit more, is that if we're all in a sense using the same tools, using the same data sets, using the same training data, are we all in a sense going to end up to a certain extent designing the same way? So this notion of diversity, I think, is to me important. And how can AI in a sense reflect on the cosmologies that it emerges out of? I think we touched upon this a little bit, but without, of course, building walls. So how do we, in a sense, connect to each other and work on something in a certain way universal, while at the same time, again, doing so in a more kind of grounded and situated way. I remember a week ago, right, in this presentation from Daniel Bolojan at NYU Shanghai, he talked about how at Deep Himmelblau they developed their own models based on the vast amount of archival data that Deep Himmelblau has. I think this is brilliant. I think potentially, Juan, you might also have to say a couple things about this. I'd be very interested. But I think this applies maybe a bit more, as I said, to a particularly design or art or architecture perspective. But I think this notion of navigating universality and diversity, for me, is also something that Digital Futures is a platform to address this topic. So it was more of a remark than a question, I guess. But thank you for this very, very inspirational, wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I think those are important, insights. That is one reason that we need competition, right? We need different versions of AI from different companies, so we have more diversity there. One issue with these large language models is that the amount of data that they need to, assimilate is become so large that it's basically all the data, right? So it's not going to be the case where each tool has different data sets, because they're all going to consume basically all the data that is available. So yeah, I think you raise good points in terms of the need for diversity and maybe not over reliance on a system that has been trained on essentially the same set of data. So maybe there is always a place for individual human minds to contribute to this and to be part of this.
We've got a couple more questions in the chat. I don't know if you can hold on for a bit, Martin, because this is such a fabulous conversation. There's so much coming out, which is super interesting. Dean McMurray has a question. Universal basic income brings to mind Jacques Fresno and his vision of the Venus Project. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how all may, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how most, in terms of most all may jobs be, I'm trying to work out what he's trying to say here. It's a mistake. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how all jobs may be automated, leaving us humans free to explore our own interests without having to worry about income?
Yeah, I mean, that's the central question here. And what I've advocated for is, some sort of a universal basic income that sort of help solve the economic problem, right? The fact that, the issue is that a job in today's world is not just a source of income, it's also a source of dignity, right? It's a source of maybe your sense of your place in the world, your sense that if you disappeared, you would be missed, right? That you're contributing something. So people get a lot more from their job than just money. So a basic income could provide at least part of the income, but it might not provide the other things that we derive from work. And so the question is, how are we going to get those things? And I think that ultimately we may have to sort of decouple what we think of as a traditional job. This job is kind of a bundle of different things, income and sense of self-worth, and we may have to deconstruct that, and in the future we get our income from a different place than we get our sense of that we're contributing something. And you can sort of imagine different ways to do that, right? You can get that sense maybe by participating in education, improving yourself, doing things in the community, volunteering, and so forth. These are all ideas that you can begin to think of, but for sure, it's an entirely different model, right? At the end of my recent book, Roll of the Robots, I talk about Star Trek, right, as one possible model. Star Trek is a very utopian show, right? People in the Star Trek universe don't have to work some boring job that they hate in order to survive, right? All you got to do is go to the materializer, I think it's called, or the fabricator, and you can get anything you want, right? That's a world of abundance. But yet in that world, people still have a purpose, right? They're out there exploring space and so forth. And we need to come up with some sort of a model like that for our future, if in fact a lot of the traditional forms of work that we now have people doing is really going to disappear, and that's going to be an enormous challenge.
I guess that hobbies could become an issue. I mean, in the UK, we have some very strange hobbies. People train spotting, for example. I can imagine you could get some meaningful existence out of that. There's a question in the chat from Yi Guo, who is from China, doing a PhD in Italy, about education. In terms of pedagogy in universities, do you think that teaching now should start to combine AI tools with traditional 3D software? How can we stop students' self-indulgent use of AI and become less word hard? I'm not sure what that means. In Italy, as a tutor or PhD students, we are not allowed to use AI. My supervisor said, if you use AI, I will be kicked, you'll knock me out, kick me out. So yes, how do we deal with this? I guess this comes down to the kind of the banning of ChatGPT in New York schools and so on. How should we deal with this?
Yeah, that's a question, and obviously different countries and different institutions are dealing with it differently. I mean, my own bias is that, yeah, I don't want students to lose the ability to write. I mean, I'm someone that is basically, my recent career has been in writing, right? Writing is something I think I'm pretty good at. But it seems now I can imagine a future where the skill of being able to write isn't really worth a whole lot if ChatGPT is going to do all the writing. And in fact, what we're seeing already is that the skill that might in fact be more valuable then is not to actually write the material yourself, but to create the prompt or the query to present to ChatGPT to get it to write effectively, right? I've actually heard that there are a number of job opportunities being advertised at high salaries for people that are skilled at writing prompts for ChatGPT-like systems. And so is that going to be the future where no one writes, we just ask the AI to do it? I find that disturbing. I think it's important that young people learn to write, and obviously if they're using ChatGPT all the time, that won't happen. But other people might have a different perspective on that, and you get into the same kind of argument you get before. Is this time different? Is writing something that is so important to the human experience that we should continue to teach it? In ancient times, people used to, for example, I know, have a much more skilled at memorizing things than we do today, right? And that's an art that has largely been lost. Could the same thing happen with our ability to write and maybe to do many other things? And then, of course, that raises the question of, at some point, to become so dependent on the technology that, if anything ever happened and the systems all went down, that we'd be, unable to survive, right? There's a famous science fiction story I know about a society that becomes completely dependent on a machine that then breaks down, and they're, big trouble.
Maybe that's to follow the question about your writing, but first I just want to comment on, as an educator, I guess, at the back of my mind, I've got this kind of critique of these new technologies, new ways of doing things by the conservatives. I mean, Prince Charles, or King Charles as he is now, used to complain about that, about people not being able to do certain things. They can't spell, they can't add up, and so on. And Douglas Rushkoff, who's a New York popular culture writer, says, well, who cares? We don't need to spell. We've got spell check. We don't need to add. We've got calculators. But it's important to recognize the new skills that are emerging that people like Charles don't understand, the kind of multitasking and so on. So it may be that the kind of paradigms we're looking at is itself shifting to new skills where writing is not so significant.
That could well be. And, obviously that's a future that will be shaped by younger people, right? And these decisions that they make in the future.
So just to say, from Mike's perspective, I had last year, I give my students one task is to do a 3-minute snippet, a kind of Black Mirror episode, shall we say, which is something they enjoy doing. But last year I had a student who did it totally on AI. He used AI to generate the text. It was before ChatGPT, but he used another system. He used Midjourney to generate images, and he used a voice synthesizer to read it out in a certain accent. And it struck me as very interesting. One of the interesting things came out of it, actually, was that the system, it said, basically, if you want to solve the problems of pollution and climate change on Earth, the best thing to do is get rid of human beings, which I thought was an interesting response, given that the assignment was due right before Halloween. It was a kind of a negative side of things. But this year around, it's become very clear that if you set a challenge to write an essay, anyone can use ChatGPT, so why even do that? So this year I've actually asked for all my assignments for that particular class to be done using AI. And rather than testing out their writing skills, I'm testing out their ability to engage with these tools in new, innovative ways. So that's just the kind of feedback from the coalface, as it were, of education. I'm not quite sure that's going to be pervasive or not, but I'm just testing that out this year. So we have a question, two more questions. Sorry, I hope you can time for these things, but one from Terry Watson. Great conversation. Thank you for acknowledging the realistic aspect of how AI can create an income distribution problem and discussing it in a way that everyone can understand. Absolutely, I second that. Fantastic to be able to make it so understandable. No one, blue collar or white collar, wants to be left behind in this advancement, and it's important to address universal solutions for everyone. I think that's a kind of comment, but I just want to add to that. I think that is just that pick up on the thing, to make things accessible is so important. And I think that books such as Rise of the Robot, Rules of the Robot make some of these debates, which are actually quite complex debates, accessible by packaging them in a very interesting way. I just wanted to ask one question. And you are a writer, which is very unusual, because in Silicon Valley, most people they're using whatever these social media apps to comment, but very few people are writing. What was the urge to write in the first place? And clearly, you are a good writer and you're very successful. But what was the driving motivation to write?
Well, I began thinking about these issues, way back in 2009, 2008, during what was the financial crisis. And I think partly as a result of that crisis and the unemployment that we saw then, I at that time was running a small software company. But I just, and I saw in my own business the impact that not so much automation, but digitization had on my business. When I started my software business in the late or in the 1990s, software was something that you delivered on a CD-ROM, right? And so when someone ordered our software that we were selling, it was a physical endeavor to actually pack up a printed manual and a CD-ROM and all of that and put it in a package and actually send it by UPS or something to the customer, right? Which is very, very different from the way software works today. But there were jobs for people to do that, right? I actually employed another company to do the fulfillment. But very, very rapidly, things changed within the industry. And actually, everything became delivered online. Nowadays, it's often software residing in the cloud. And actually, the company that I outsourced that physical fulfillment to actually went out of business because there wasn't any need for it anymore. And so as I saw that kind of progression, I mean, the impact of these technologies was obvious, and I began to think more about, in particular, artificial intelligence and robotics. And that's when I wrote my first book back in 2009. Writing is something I've always enjoyed, since college. I always kind of had this vague idea that maybe someday I'd like to write a book. But for some reason, around that time, this whole idea that AI was going to advance rapidly, it was going to probably become our most important technology, and that it was going to potentially have a huge impact on employment, kind of coalesced, and I began to write on that particular subject. My first book, The Lights in the Tunnel, was actually self-published. You can find that on Amazon.
We've got one more question I want to ask, but just before that, I want to ask you about writing. What are you working on now? I assume that you're churning the ideas and there's another book in the pipeline.
Not really, not yet. I mean, my books have mostly had a gap of like 4 or 5 years between them. So right now, so much is happening. Things are moving so rapidly that I'm just kind of absorbing that. I'm going to a lot of events, conferences. I do a lot of public speaking at different events, and that gives me an opportunity to talk to many different people and different, like this group. This is the first time I've talked to a group of architects, and I've learned some things about how you're deploying this technology. So as I do that at more and more events, I will get more ideas for exactly what the next book should be. But right now, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the final question is from Lorena. You touch on AI being capable of powering virtual and augmented reality. Do you foresee a regulatory agency that will govern the augmented reality overlays on our physical world the same way as we have regulations for building design?
I think it's quite possible. Yeah, I mean, definitely there are going to be huge issues there. I mean, that's virtual reality where you're actually immersing yourself into a completely fabricated world. I think ultimately has the potential to be addictive in the way that drugs are addictive. I mean, you know, already we see, you know, there was recently a study done that found that you know, we have this problem where many young people who should be either at school or they should be in the workforce are neither, right? These are people that have completely dropped out. They're not being educated. They're not working. What are they doing? And this study tried to look into that. And what they found is that overwhelmingly, what they're doing is they're playing video games, right? This is become already an incredibly addictive technology that has actually had an impact on productivity. It's actually drawn people out of the workforce, especially young men, and you know, they've become really non-productive citizens as a result of that. You know, virtual reality and maybe augmented reality as well is going to put that on steroids, right? It's going to be, you know, if you think video games are addictive, imagine what it's going to be like when you can actually immerse yourself into a world that may ultimately become almost indistinguishable from the real world, how addictive that's going to be. So yeah, there's going to be a real need to regulate different aspects of those technologies. And there's going to be a very tight integration between virtual and augmented reality and between artificial intelligence, for sure. So many of there's going to be a lot of overlap between the issues that come into play there.
No, absolutely. I think that the danger of escaping the reality of our world into some other alternative reality may be more acceptable or comforting or reassuring, and not dealing with the harsh realities of life is I think going to be a real issue in many ways. I just want to finish off. I know this has been so fantastic, Martin. Thank you so much. It's really, I mean, I'm familiar with your work, but I think what we're getting is feedback here is remarkable. Everyone else is picking up on this thing, and hopefully you will have a huge kind of fan club within the architectural world. I think you will automatically from today's session. But maybe I just ask you one just general question, especially for the students of today, who are really, I mean, facing this situation. You know, particularly, you know, the possibility of going out there into the workforce and discovering at the peak of their careers that maybe there is no work out there. What advice would you give, or not the same amount of work? What advice would you give for the college students of today, and how they should approach their future career?
Right. You know, what I would say is that, you know, it's not about choosing a particular profession. Like some people would say, oh, don't be an accountant because accountants are going to be automated. I don't think that's right. I think that the impact of this technology is going to be within professions. And what you want to do is whatever you choose to do, whatever profession you choose, you want to make sure that you're focusing on the kinds of capabilities and tasks that are least likely to be automated. And for college students, I would put those into mainly two categories. One, as we've been talking a lot about here, is creativity, right? If you're doing something that's genuinely creative, and especially if it's a creative endeavor that integrates knowledge and expertise from many different areas in a way that I said architecture does, as opposed to, for example, maybe graphic design, which is more narrow, right? If you're doing something creative that's also more holistic, then I think that for the foreseeable future, AI is likely to be a tool that enhances your capability rather than something that replaces you. And the second area that I think is going to be relatively safe from the onslaught from AI are those jobs that involve very sophisticated interaction with other people, relationship building with other people, empathy, like you would see in a nurse or a doctor, for example, working with patients. Those kinds of qualities, you know, are harder to replicate in machines, and it's going to be a long time before, you know, algorithms can truly build relationships with people, I think. You know, again, in both of those areas, you do see some encroachment, right? You see the generative AI models like Midjourney that clearly can be creative, right? You see AI chat systems that can provide basic mental health counseling to people, help people with depression, things like that. So you do see artificial intelligence also encroaching on areas that we would think of as, highly human in terms of interaction. But I do think that if you focus on those two areas and make sure that whatever you're doing in your career incorporates a lot of that kind of capability, then you're going to be relatively safe. But in general, the last thing you want to be doing is a job where you're sitting in front of a computer doing something routine and predictable, cranking out the same report again and again, the same presentation, the same kind of quantitative analysis again and again. All of that kind of work is definitely going to be highly susceptible to automation. So you want to shift away from that and toward work that is more creative and work that really engages with other people and builds relationships with other people. That would be the best advice that I can give.
Yeah. I mean, just a final comment for me, I think what we're discovering because Midjourney has been very significant in architecture so far, and I'm sure there'll be other systems very, very soon that come in, but it's just at that level of image generation, is that we're discovering that if you can use ChatGPT to generate anything very quickly. I mean, I could produce a fashion show in Paris or outfits in about 10 minutes on ChatGPT, on Midjourney. But the crucial question is selecting these things. In other words, you can produce all these different opportunities, but you have to have a real eye to be able to select what is the right one. And particularly in the area of fashion, which I'm not a fashion designer, and I end up designing or generating these outcomes that are all female fashions. I'm not female and I'm not a fashion designer. So there's still the role of the connoisseur, shall we say, the expert, to really be able to judge these things. And I think that's to my mind what's happening is in some senses that what AI has done so far, and certainly in terms of Midjourney, is enhance the capacity to generate possible outcomes. So we have a vast range of possibilities, but then it's up to us to judge it. So in terms of the GAN, the generator, the discriminator, it really privileges the discriminator, those with taste, with an eye for things, to be able to select something from that. And I think out of that, you're getting a huge burst of, let's call it creativity anyway, of new things coming out. But I think, you also talk about in terms of industries about how AI will generate new forms of opportunities, and we don't know what exactly, but I can see already signs of something emerging. So the future still depends on human judgment, on human connoisseurship, shall we say, on taste and so on, in order to select those things and go forward with them. Enhanced, of course, by AI.
That's for the foreseeable future. That's absolutely true. But again, we may reach a point where, we have true human level artificial intelligence, at which point that would really be a game changer.
Yeah, I mean, if it knows our tastes in terms of the news we want, if Spotify knows our music, and so on, if Amazon knows what books we like, then the next step is going to be taking over that connoisseurship thing. It will be able to at least address that. Martin, thank you so much. This has been, I'm a huge fan of yours anyway. I've read your books. I want to encourage the architectural community to read these books. Super fascinating resources. I think The Rule of the Robots is an incredibly comprehensive study of the landscape, as it were, in terms of technology today, and a very informed one. I feel like I'm sort of a bit distant from Silicon Valley, and I can say certain things, but Martin, you have the kind of fly on the wall connection there, and a situation whereby you can engage with people like Ray Kurzweil and Geoffrey Hinton and so on, and it's really a great resource. I want to just hope that you can. I'm looking forward to the next book, and I know that there's something bubbling up there somewhere. And I think it's so important to have these voices to explain things and to bring things together from an informed position. So I want to thank you not only for your contribution today. Wonderful session. There's a lot of nice positive comments in the chat, but also in terms of the books themselves. Keep going. That's what I would say. I mean, I know that books are going to be out of fashion fairly soon, but I still think there's a role for them. And importantly, for those that make access to these otherwise impenetrable things, who can write in a clear way and present the world of technology in an accessible fashion for the general public. So just please keep going, and I look forward to that possibility, and hopefully also to engaging you in the future, because this has been so fantastic. I also want to thank the Digital Futures team behind this, Michael, especially in Berlin, Bavling in Miami, and so on, who are putting this together. This is a team effort. And let's see this as not the end of a session, but the beginning of a dialogue that hopefully will continue. And thank you so much. It's not easy to get up at 7 in the morning to go and do these things, but it's been incredibly resourceful. We will upload this YouTube to our library, to our YouTube library, and it will have an afterlife that will go on and on. And so thank you, Martin. It was really a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a really great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Next week, I will be talking. We have 6 weeks of this, and let's see how it goes. But thank you so much, everyone, today, and thank you especially to Martin. Thank you.
Yeah, we can end the meeting now.
Okay.